And now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, Mr. President, we welcome the President of the International Court of Justice, Joan Donoghue, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and Professor Dapo Akande. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank the delegation of the United States for the professional and impartial chairing of the Security Council last month. We hope that this same professional approach will guide the delegation of Albania in chairing this month. For several months, we've seen a high level of hypocrisy in statements from the countries of the West, who've suddenly decided to recall the existence of international law against the background of Russia's special military operation. During the attacks by NATO countries on Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, international law was only recalled as an annoying obstacle. In their vain attempts to justify their own aggression against sovereign countries, the collective West devised exotic conceptions such as humanitarian intervention, the war on terror, or preventive strikes. All of these, of course, had nothing to do with international law. Therefore, the military escapades of the United States and their NATO allies were nothing other than aggressive, unprovoked wars of choice. International law, including the UN Charter, was something that the NATO countries cynically and systematically ignored. The United States, at the highest political level, said that it was exceptional. In other words, that it stood above international law. After this, the collective West began with maniacal constancy to put forward the idea of replacing traditional international law with some kind of rules-based order. The appointing of such a collection of norms meant that essentially a narrow group of countries were coming up with their own rules and claiming they were universal. This is the logic that we see working when countries in the West today develop that idea around international criminal justice, stating that when it comes to attempts to punish our country, when there is a threat of prosecution of NATO soldiers for war crimes or crimes against humanity. However, we see a completely different kind of activity. Western countries do everything that they can to shield their own troops. We're talking about financial and organizational levers of action on mechanisms of international legal justice as well as direct threats. What's very illustrative here was the United States' introduction of personal sanctions on the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. As we know, there are also crimes from British and American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, and these were deprioritized by the new prosecutor. In other words, the investigation into them was suspended. We can see that as soon as it's an issue of troops from Western countries being held responsible, suddenly the fight against impunity becomes not so important. In attempts to justify themselves, Western countries usually say that their legal systems themselves are able to deal with holding those people accountable, saying simply that the ICC isn't necessary for this. But we don't see any sentences being held down on the troops of the United States or of the United Kingdom or other countries for war crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Incidentally, when it comes to the crimes and the terrible torture in Guantanamo and the secret prisons in the CIA in European countries, we would never have heard about them if it weren't for the sensational material published by Julian Assange. And there are also the countries that are eloquently advocating this fight against impunity. But what did they do when this information became available to the general public? Did they rush to investigate and to hold accountable their citizens? No. The only true hunt that was started was against Assange himself. The UK, for example, handed this brave journalist to the United States where he's going to be tried for espionage. Or that's what's planned anyway. The police system in the United States also leaves no doubt that he will spend the rest of his life behind bars if he lives long enough to get to court. All of this is what you need to know about the approaches of the collective West to the fight against impunity when they're talking about their own people. What do we have ultimately then when it comes to the atrocities by NATO troops? The scenario is always the same. There are people who have died, civilians who have died, but there is no one there to answer for that. No one there to be punished, even in disciplinary terms, not even talking about criminal prosecution. There's also the confusing justifications given by the representative of the Pentagon, John Kibry, on the 17th of May. He mentioned an American airstrike which killed a number of civilians near the Syrian town of Baghous, and he called it a tragic mistake. However, he gave it to be understood that none of the American military would be held accountable or had been held accountable. This isn't the first such case in Syria, and possibly it's not the last. The United States, together with its colleagues for this strictly defensive union of NATO, continued this illegal occupation of part of the territory of this sovereign country, even after their military aggression against it. There's another example of the hypocrisy of the West and the crusaders for international criminal justice, and that's the news from the Netherlands. Recently, it was stated that the Netherlands was to send a whole brigade of investigators and criminologists to Ukraine to work in the interests of the ICC prosecutor. Practically in parallel with this, there was information about the suspension by the national law enforcement authorities of investigations into Dutch soldiers who had carried out a strike against houses in the Afghan village of Uruzgan in 2007, where there was no military objective. Once again, it's the same scenario. There are civilians who have died, but people to take responsibility for these war crimes are nowhere to be found. Indeed, why do the countries of the West need the International Court? It seems that their own courts can deal with these cases against troops and the imitation of the fight against impunity. The West needs the ICC purely as a political instrument, and nobody hides this. That's why there's this campaign to give the prosecutor unprecedented financial, human resources and organizational resources, and that's given by those same countries who recently did everything to limit it from prosecuting their own soldiers. This isn't even just double standards, it's simply barefaced cynicism. Justice is being turned into a farce. Who is guilty is outlined in advance, and the court paid for by the West puts through the sentences that the West has paid for. Neither the ICC nor the West wants to look at the many crimes carried out by the Kiev regime that came to power as the result of a bloody coup in 2014. What's been consigned to oblivion is the case of the unknown snipers who methodically shot dead the protesters of the Maidan and also law enforcement. There was a similar scenario that we saw in many of the colour revolutions. Our colleagues won't mention the civilians in Donbass either, who've been killed by Ukrainian bombardments for the last 8 years, which incidentally are also continuing today. Nobody is it calling for Ukraine to be held to account for the fact that nationalists have burnt people alive in the House of Trade Unions in Odessa. It's got to the situation where those people who are promoting Nazi and inhumane ideologies, the criminals from the Azov battalion, are described by the West as heroes, not only of Ukraine, but also as their own heroes. There are swastikas and other Nazi symbols that are to be seen on their uniforms, but also on their bodies. These people don't embarrass the self-proclaimed upholders of democratic values, who continue to repeat the mantra that there is no Nazism in Ukraine and that this is simply Russian propaganda. Mr. President, a number of countries in the Council today have touched on the issue of the delivery of the international order on the 16th of March on the provisional measures presented by Ukraine with reference to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948. The statements by our American and British colleagues were the latest examples of this double standard. We well remember how the United States, after losing the international court case brought by Nicaragua, not only refused to fulfill its decision, and this we are talking here about a final judgment of the court and not about any kind of temporary order, but also repeatedly vetoed the Security Council's corresponding resolution. They did it twice. The United Kingdom also, in its deeds and not only its words, showed its relation to the International Court when refusing to complete the process of decolonisation and finally return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. The court, in its advisory opinion of the 25th of February 2019, unambiguously stated that the United Kingdom has an obligation to bring to an end its administration of the Chagos Islands as soon as possible. The position of the court was supported by the General Assembly Resolution 73/295, against which, besides the United Kingdom and the United States, only 4 delegations voted. This circumstance certainly didn't embarrass London, which even today continues its colonial occupation of the archipelago, using it for the deployment of a US military base. The land clearing for the American military facility was also accompanied by the violent displacement of the local population. When considering the mentioned resolution of the General Assembly, the United Kingdom was called on to pay fair contribution to those who'd been affected by crimes against humanity. These calls were repeatedly rejected. All of this leads us to a very simple conclusion. Western countries are ready to talk in high emotion about fulfilling the provisions of the UN's international, or of the International Court of Justice, and the fight against impunity and compensation for victims, exactly until the point when it refers to their own people. Mr. President, I'll say a few words about the International Court's comments of the 16th of March, the order on the provisional measures. This was made on the basis of demands from Ukraine not to suffer from the use of force, but on the basis of mendacious accusations. In lines of mendacious accusations in violation of the provisions of the Convention. I have to draw your attention to the similarity to the situation in 1999. At that time, Yugoslavia referred to the Convention on Genocide and also tried to achieve temporary measures. The International Court at that time completely refused Yugoslavia's petition because it contravened NATO. At the time of the measures for Ukraine, the situation is exactly the opposite. Here, there is the detailed legal argumentation, and through it we see a simple thesis. There is political pressure on the court to make and that might lead to an inconsistent decision, and that's what's being seen also from the West. On the 20th of May, 41 Western countries and the European Union, with the support of the Marshall Islands and Micronesia, sent to the court a so-called joint statement. This was an unprecedented attempt to influence the position of the court in the favour of Ukraine. Otherwise, the situation to suspend military operations made by the court simply in the context of the genocide, of the Convention on Genocide, and that cannot cover the really stated aims and objectives and justifications for the special military operation. We'd therefore like to recall that our special military operation began on the basis of Article 51 of the UN's Charter. The corresponding notification, in the way stipulated by the article, was sent by us to the Security Council in writing on the 24th of February. The question of the cancellation of the outstanding provisions of the UN Charter, including its Article 51, or the denial of member states of their right to carry out their inalienable right to collective or individual self-defense, as far as we know, was not considered by the International Court of Justice. Mr. President, now virtually every day we are hearing about initiatives to create so-called investigative mechanisms or quasi-tribunals. The most interesting thing, however, is how these tribunals on Russia are being churned out. The attempt is to do this on the basis of an agreement between the interested countries. Only, let's think about this. A group of countries are seriously discussing the possibility of jointly condemning some kind of other third state. The mechanisms of international criminal justice, of course, are far from ideal. But when they were founded, there was at least a look of impartiality and geographic balance to them. Now, however, the mask has finally slipped. The collective West considers itself in right to carry out its own unanimous justice. Mr. President, pumping Ukraine full of weapons allegedly to anchor its potential and possibility to repel Russia, the West has once again carried out this latest war crime. Ukrainian raiders, with their assistance, are continuing to bombard the areas of the Donbass where civilians live, as they've been doing for 8 years, killing women, old people and children. This is another example. The United Kingdom has delivering long-range howitzers, the M777, and on the eve of the International Day for the Defense of Children from shells, this weapon killed 5 people in Makeyevka in Donetsk, including a 5-year-old girl. The United States also said that it's going to deliver to Ukraine multiple rocket launchers. This will lead only to a further escalation in the conflict, which is a conflict that Washington is mendaciously saying it wants to end as soon as possible. This is also something that the ICC should think about, of course, if it really does want to deal with justice. The track record of crimes of the most active protectors of international justice is a long one. Today we've touched on just an infinitesimal number of those. For a full list, no speech would be long enough. The collective West, I would recommend just one thing to them. If you want to condemn aggression, begin with yourselves. Show examples of condemning your own military adventures and your illegal economic restrictions, your bloodthirsty colonial and neo-colonial wars, genocides, and your raiding of indigenous peoples. Begin by playing those who've suffered, those countries and nations, paying them compensation. This step might actually bring us closer to having a fair world order where there would be no place for any self-proclaimed exceptionalism. Thank you very much.
In abiding with the rules and in respect of the procedure of the Council, I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement